Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are tracking some of the most consequential stories on migration, borders, and the human cost of political decisions around the world.
And I'm Maya Clarity. We have a packed show tonight. From military strikes on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, to desperate migrants drowning in the Mediterranean, to a radical rewrite of labor laws in Argentina that could reshape the lives of millions of workers. These stories are connected in ways that might not be obvious at first glance, and we're going to pull those threads tonight.
We're also going to look at how these conflicts and policy shifts are creating new waves of displaced people, new categories of vulnerability, and new questions about who gets to move freely in this world and who doesn't.
That's exactly right, Alex. Because when you look at the global picture right now, what you see is a tightening. Borders hardening, labor protections weakening, and the people caught in between paying the highest price. Let's get into it.
We start tonight with an escalating military confrontation that has massive implications for migration and displacement across South and Central Asia. Clashes along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border have intensified dramatically, with Pakistan launching strikes on Kabul and other Afghan cities. Let's break down what we know.
According to Al Jazeera's reporting, this is not a minor border skirmish. We are talking about Pakistani military strikes hitting the Afghan capital, Kabul, along with other cities. The stated justification from Islamabad is counterterrorism, specifically targeting what Pakistan says are militant hideouts linked to the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, which has been launching attacks from Afghan soil.
And here's where the context matters enormously. Since the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan in August 2021, Pakistan has watched with growing alarm as the TTP has found safe haven across the border. Pakistan has long accused the Taliban government of either harboring or failing to control these militants. The Taliban, for their part, deny providing support and have condemned these strikes as a violation of Afghan sovereignty.
The humanitarian dimension here is staggering. Afghanistan is already in the grip of one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet. The United Nations has estimated that more than 23 million Afghans, that's more than half the population, need humanitarian assistance. Now layer military strikes on top of that, and you have a recipe for mass displacement on a scale that could dwarf what we've already seen.
And let's not forget the context of Pakistan's own deportation campaign. Starting in late 2023, Pakistan began forcibly expelling Afghan refugees, many of whom had lived in Pakistan for decades. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, estimated that hundreds of thousands of Afghans were pushed back across the border into a country with no functioning economy and a government under international sanctions.
So think about what that means for ordinary Afghan families right now. You've got people who were deported from Pakistan back into Afghanistan, who are now potentially facing Pakistani airstrikes in the very cities they were sent back to. The cruelty of that cycle is hard to overstate. These are people with no safe ground to stand on.
And the geopolitical stakes here extend far beyond the immediate border region. China has significant economic interests in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Iran shares a border with Afghanistan and has its own concerns about refugee flows. Any wider conflict destabilizes the entire region and could trigger displacement that ripples across Central Asia, into Iran, and potentially toward Europe.
What I want our viewers to understand is that border conflicts like this one don't stay contained. When you bomb cities, you create refugees. When you create refugees, you create political crises in every country along their path. Pakistan and Afghanistan are not just fighting over territory. They're setting in motion human consequences that will be felt for years, possibly decades.
And the international community's response has been muted at best. The UN Security Council has been largely silent. Washington, which spent 20 years fighting its own war in Afghanistan, has offered little beyond calls for restraint. When the great powers look away from conflicts like this, the people who pay the price are always the most vulnerable, the families, the children, the displaced.
The question we need to keep asking is, who benefits from this escalation? Because it's not ordinary Pakistanis, who face TTP attacks at home. And it's certainly not ordinary Afghans, who just want to survive. The beneficiaries are military establishments justifying their budgets, political leaders looking for nationalist rallying cries, and arms suppliers who profit from every escalation. Follow the money, and you'll find the real story behind any border conflict.
Now let's turn to the Mediterranean, where the story of migration and human suffering continues to play out in some of the most horrific ways imaginable. Al Jazeera is reporting on the deadly journeys that refugees and migrants are undertaking to reach Europe, with a particular focus on the abuse they face in Libya.
This is a story that has been unfolding for years, but it demands our attention because the situation is getting worse, not better. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, refugees and migrants crossing through Libya face systematic abuse at the hands of militias. We're talking about extortion, forced labor, sexual violence, and in some cases outright murder. Libya has become a corridor of horrors for people seeking safety in Europe.
And let's be absolutely clear about how we got here. When NATO intervened in Libya in 2011, helping to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, the country collapsed into a patchwork of militia-controlled territories. There has been no stable central government since. What exists instead is a constellation of armed groups that profit from the smuggling of human beings.
The European Union's response to this crisis has been, frankly, unconscionable. Rather than creating safe and legal pathways for people fleeing war and persecution, the EU has poured hundreds of millions of euros into the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, which is itself linked to militias and smuggling networks. The strategy is simple and brutal: pay Libya to stop people from reaching European shores, regardless of what happens to those people in the process.
The numbers tell a devastating story. The International Organization for Migration has documented thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean over the past decade. But those are only the bodies that are found. The true number of people who have drowned attempting the crossing is almost certainly much higher. And that doesn't count those who die in the Sahara Desert trying to reach the Libyan coast in the first place.
What strikes me about this story is the gap between European rhetoric and European action. EU leaders talk constantly about human rights, about the rules-based international order, about dignity. But when desperate people show up at their borders, the response is walls, detention, and deals with authoritarian regimes and militia groups to keep them away.
And the demographics of who is making these crossings are important to understand. These are not, as some politicians like to claim, economic opportunists looking for a better deal. Many are fleeing active conflicts: the war in Sudan, instability in the Sahel region, persecution in Eritrea, the collapse of Somalia. These are people exercising their legal right under international law to seek asylum.
The 1951 Refugee Convention is supposed to guarantee that right. But what we're witnessing is a systematic effort by wealthy nations to make it physically impossible for people to exercise it. If you can't reach a country's border, you can't claim asylum. That's the logic behind the externalization of border control, and it is, in practice, a way of gutting refugee protections without formally repealing them.
I want to highlight something else from the reporting. The abuse in Libya isn't random. It's industrialized. Militia groups operate detention centers where migrants are held in appalling conditions and essentially ransomed. Families back home receive phone calls with their loved ones screaming in the background, told to wire money or their relative will be killed. This is a kidnapping industry operating at scale.
And European governments know this. They have known for years. Multiple investigations, including by the UN, have documented exactly what happens to people intercepted at sea by the Libyan Coast Guard and returned to Libya. The EU funds these operations knowing full well that the people intercepted will face torture and abuse. That is not a bug in the system. It is the system.
The deeper question here is about what kind of world we're building. When the response to human suffering is to make the suffering invisible rather than to address it, when we pay others to do our dirty work at arm's length, we are making a choice about our values. And that choice has consequences, not just for the migrants, but for the soul of the societies that turn away.
Absolutely. And this connects directly to our next story, because the forces that drive migration are not just war and persecution. They are also economic. When governments strip away labor protections and depress wages, they create conditions that push people to move. Which brings us to Argentina.
Argentina's Senate is on the verge of approving what critics are calling the most sweeping rollback of labor protections in the country's modern history. Under President Javier Milei, who styles himself an anarcho-capitalist, the government is pushing through legislation that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between workers, employers, and unions.
According to The Guardian's reporting, the overhaul targets several pillars of Argentine labor law. It would reduce severance pay obligations, extend allowable working hours, weaken collective bargaining rights, and make it significantly easier for employers to hire workers on precarious short-term contracts. The government argues this will attract investment and create jobs. Critics say it will create exploitation.
Let's put this in context. Argentina has a long and proud tradition of strong labor unions, dating back to the Peronist era in the mid-20th century. Those unions have been a counterweight to economic inequality in a country that has lurched from crisis to crisis. What Milei is attempting is not just an economic reform. It's an ideological project to dismantle the institutional power of organized labor.
And the timing is critical. Argentina is still reeling from years of economic turmoil, hyperinflation, and a punishing recession. Milei was elected precisely because people were desperate for change. But the question is, change for whom? When you cut severance pay and extend working hours, the beneficiaries are employers and investors. The people who bear the cost are the workers who have the least bargaining power to begin with.
The Guardian's reporting includes voices from Argentine labor advocates who are warning that these reforms will lead to, and I'm quoting here, more exploitation, fewer rights. And history backs them up. We've seen this playbook before, in Chile under Pinochet, in Britain under Thatcher, in the United States under Reagan. The pattern is always the same: deregulate labor markets, weaken unions, and promise that the wealth will trickle down. It never does.
What concerns me about the Argentine situation is the migration dimension. When you strip away labor protections in a country that is already a destination for migrants from neighboring countries like Bolivia, Paraguay, and Venezuela, you create a two-tier labor market. Employers gain even more leverage over migrant workers, who are already vulnerable because of their immigration status. Weaker labor laws become a tool for exploitation of the most vulnerable.
And there's a broader pattern here that we see across Latin America. Governments facing economic crises often turn to what the IMF euphemistically calls structural adjustment, which in practice means cutting the social safety net and making labor cheaper. The result, time and again, is increased inequality, social unrest, and ultimately more migration, as people flee countries where they can no longer survive.
Milei's supporters will argue that rigid labor laws have held Argentina back, that businesses need flexibility to compete globally, that the old system protected insiders at the expense of the unemployed. And there are legitimate debates to be had about labor market design. But let's be honest about what's happening here. This isn't a nuanced reform. It's a demolition project, backed by the same libertarian ideology that has produced widening inequality everywhere it's been tried.
The street protests in Buenos Aires tell you everything you need to know. Hundreds of thousands of Argentine workers and their families understand exactly what these reforms mean for their daily lives. Longer hours, less security, less power to negotiate. And when workers lose that power, they don't just lose money. They lose dignity. They lose the ability to plan for the future. They lose the social fabric that holds communities together.
And let's connect this to the global picture. Argentina is not acting in a vacuum. This labor reform agenda aligns with a worldwide push by business interests and right-wing governments to roll back the gains workers made in the 20th century. From gig economy deregulation in the United States to anti-union laws in Europe, we are seeing a coordinated assault on the very idea that workers deserve protections and a fair share of the wealth they create.
Now, before we move to our synthesis, let's touch on a story that might seem unrelated but actually illuminates something important about how urban development, habitat loss, and human-wildlife conflict intersect with how we think about borders and shared space. In Hong Kong, 4 people were injured after a wild boar wandered into a residential area and an MTR station.
According to the South China Morning Post, a wild boar was found roaming inside Wu Kai Sha Station and the Lake Silver housing complex. 3 people, ranging in age from 45 to 87, were knocked down and suffered leg injuries. A 68-year-old woman was bitten by the animal. Police received multiple reports of sightings beginning around 5 in the evening.
Now, this might seem like a quirky local news story, but it's actually part of a much bigger pattern. Hong Kong has been grappling with an increasing number of wild boar incursions into urban areas. The reason is straightforward: as development expands into the countryside, animals lose their habitat and are pushed into human spaces. The border between the wild and the urban is collapsing.
And here's why I think this matters in the context of tonight's show. We talk a lot about human borders, the lines we draw between nations, the walls we build, the policies we create to keep certain people in and others out. But borders are also about our relationship with the natural world. When we encroach on animal habitats without restraint, we create conflict. When we ignore the needs of ecosystems, we pay the price. The wild boar in the MTR station is a small but vivid reminder that you cannot wall yourself off from the consequences of your own choices.
Hong Kong authorities have struggled with this issue for years. There have been debates about culling programs versus relocation, about urban planning that accounts for wildlife corridors, about how to balance development with ecological sustainability. These are fundamentally questions about coexistence, the same kind of questions we face when we talk about human migration.
That's a sharp observation. Because at its core, the question is always the same. How do we share space? How do we accommodate the movement of living beings, whether human or animal, in a world of finite resources and expanding pressures? The answers we come up with reveal our values and our priorities.
Now let's pull all of these threads together, because tonight's stories, taken as a whole, paint a picture that I think our viewers need to see clearly.
When you line up what we've covered tonight, Pakistan bombing Afghanistan, migrants drowning in the Mediterranean, Argentina gutting labor protections, even wild boars being squeezed out of their habitats, you see a single underlying dynamic. The powerful are consolidating control over resources and space, and the displaced, whether human or animal, are bearing the consequences.
Think about it. Pakistan's military strikes create refugees. Europe's border policies drown those refugees or trap them in Libyan torture camps. Argentina's labor reforms strip protections from the workers who do make it to a destination country. At every stage of the journey, from displacement to transit to arrival, the system is designed to extract value from vulnerable people while denying them basic rights.
And this isn't accidental. The global economy as currently structured depends on a supply of cheap, desperate, movable labor. Conflict creates that supply. Weak labor laws ensure that supply stays cheap. And militarized borders ensure that labor can be exploited because workers without legal status have no leverage to demand better conditions. It's a machine, Alex, and it runs on human suffering.
What I find most disturbing is the moral framework that enables all of this. We've constructed a world where it's considered normal to spend billions on border walls and military strikes, but radical to suggest that people fleeing violence deserve safe passage. Where cutting workers' severance pay is called reform, but raising the minimum wage is called socialism. The language itself has been corrupted to serve power.
And the media plays a role in this too. When we cover migration as a crisis rather than as a consequence, when we frame refugees as threats rather than as people exercising their rights, when we report on labor reforms using the government's own euphemisms, we become complicit in the system we should be exposing.
That's why shows like this one exist. Because the job of journalism is not to repeat what powerful people want you to hear. It's to tell you what they don't want you to know. And what they don't want you to know is that the crises of migration, labor exploitation, and displacement are not separate problems. They are features of a global system that prioritizes profit over people, borders over human rights, and control over compassion.
So what do we do with this information? First, we pay attention. We refuse to let these stories be buried under celebrity gossip and culture war distractions. Second, we demand accountability. When our governments fund Libyan militias or sell weapons to countries that bomb civilians, we hold them responsible. Third, we support the organizations on the ground, the aid workers, the labor organizers, the journalists who are doing this work at enormous personal risk.
And finally, we reject the false choice between security and humanity. It is possible to have orderly migration systems that also respect human dignity. It is possible to have dynamic economies that also protect workers' rights. It is possible to develop cities that also preserve natural habitats. These are not utopian fantasies. They are policy choices, and they are available to any society that has the political will to make them.
The people drowning in the Mediterranean, the families fleeing Pakistani airstrikes, the Argentine workers facing longer hours and less pay, they are not abstractions. They are human beings whose lives are shaped by decisions made in boardrooms and parliaments they will never enter. Our job, as journalists and as citizens, is to make sure their stories are told and their rights are defended.
That's our show for tonight. I'm Alex Truth. Thank you for watching, thank you for thinking critically, and thank you for refusing to look away.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Remember, the truth doesn't report itself. We'll see you next time on Truth Report. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and take care of each other. Good night.